Hello, everyone. We're so pleased you've joined us for our talk on compensation for everyday challenges experienced by autistic people. My name is Greg Wallace, and I'm an associate professor at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by Goldie McQuaid, a research assistant professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. We will start by providing a very brief outline of what we plan to talk about today. First, we will be discussing existing findings to date on compensatory approaches utilized by autistic people, primarily to address social differences. Second, we will discuss our own preliminary findings examining compensation strategies autistic adults use to address their differences in sensory processing, executive function, and daily living skills. Let's start with what we know about compensatory approaches used by autistic people. So how might we define compensation broadly? Livingston and Happe, in their overview of the concept of compensation among people with neurodevelopmental conditions, described it as people achieving typical or better than expected performance on a task through the recruitment of additional cognitive, psychological, neurobiological, or other resources. In other words, people are relying on other resources to compensate for challenges they might experience in one particular area. For example, autistic people might think of topics for quote-unquote small talk ahead of time when anticipating meeting new people. The notion of compensation or compensatory skills in autism is relatively new in research. Nevertheless, there have been notable examples of autobiographical accounts describing how autistic people, quote-unquote, mask or, quote-unquote, pass in a predominantly neurotypical world. As implied by these terms, compensation in autism has often been conceptualized vis-a-vis social differences linked to autism. In addition to, quote-unquote, masking and, quote-unquote, passing as autistic, other terms are used to describe such compensation, including adaptive morphing, camouflaging, and social compensation. Let's center autistic voices by starting with autobiographical accounts of autistic lived experiences. These accounts describe many instances of quote-unquote pretending to be non-autistic or masking. These anecdotal accounts in turn spurred qualitative research, particularly on the experiences of social compensation, as well as quantitative research, including the development of self-report measures that are now widely used. The most prominent example is likely the Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire, or CAT-Q, developed by Hull and colleagues. Importantly, compensation for social differences has been reported across the lifespan for autistic people, including in studies of children, adolescents, and adults. Additional findings to date indicate that both autistic adolescents and autistic adults report more social compensation relative to neurotypical adolescents and adults. Research has also begun to investigate demographic and other factors that are linked to social compensation among autistic people. For example, greater social compensation is associated with later age at autism diagnosis, more mental health challenges such as depression, anxiety, and suicidality, and better executive functioning skills, such as being able to plan and organize or being able to regulate emotions in various situations. Across studies and samples, autistic people assigned female sex at birth have consistently reported greater use of social compensation than those assigned male sex at birth. Studies have also begun to explore gender identity and social compensation. To date, a couple of studies have shown that gender-diverse autistic people use more social compensation than cisgender autistic people. The conceptualization of compensation in autism often focuses on ways an autistic person changes their own behavior. Accordingly, most of the measures we use to assess compensation focus on how autistic people change their own behavior to quote-unquote compensate for everyday challenges they experience. This is akin to the medical model of disability, wherein the focus is entirely on the person with the disability, as opposed to the environmental and social barriers they face. However, how well a person fits with their environment is critical. This person-environment fit harkens to the neurodiversity perspective, wherein disability is partially dependent on how your brain fits in your own context, such as culture, time, physical space, etc. This viewpoint is more akin to the social model of disability, wherein one focuses on social, environmental, and other barriers to optimal functioning. Thus, in our research, we want to create and utilize questionnaires that measure not only how people change their behavior to compensate for challenges they face, but also how they change their environment to do so. Most conceptualizations of compensation in autism also focus narrowly on social differences rather than broader challenges across domains. Autistic people frequently cite other areas as representing barriers to optimal outcomes, including executive function challenges, sensory processing differences, and daily living skills difficulties. Therefore, we sought to investigate possible compensatory strategies and approaches that autistic people harness to combat challenges experienced in the areas of sensory processing, executive functioning, and daily living skills. The responses we received to a series of questionnaires examining each of these areas represent our quantitative findings. We also asked autistic people to provide information on their lived experiences of other forms of compensation that we did not capture in our questionnaires. The responses provided by autistic adults to this open-ended question represent our qualitative findings.
Thus, we are now going to delve into our own ongoing study on the broad topic of compensation skills in autism. Our study hypotheses were as follows. We predicted that autistic adults would employ a wide variety of strategies to compensate for their differences in executive function, sensory processing, and daily living skills domains. We also hypothesized that autistic people assigned female sex at birth would engage in more of these compensatory strategies than those assigned male sex at birth. For this study, we recruited autistic adults currently living in the United States who were aged 18 and older with a professional diagnosis or self-diagnosis of autism. We used targeted online recruitment strategies. To ensure data integrity, the study utilized individualized study links, bot defeating tactics, and quality control measures. The next few slides will describe the people who have participated in our study so far. This sample includes 216 autistic adults, ranging in age from 18 to 81 years, with an average age of 33 years. More than 2/3 of the people in the sample are assigned female sex at birth. About a quarter of the people in the sample identify as gender diverse. The sample is largely white and non-Hispanic. In terms of educational attainment, roughly 60% of the sample report having a bachelor's degree or higher, while a quarter report that they are currently enrolled in an education program. More than half of the sample are currently employed, and 86% report ever having been employed. In this sample, the average age at autism diagnosis was fairly late, at about 25 years. Most of the sample report a professional autism diagnosis. Among the self-diagnosed participants, many report that they are currently being professionally evaluated for an autism diagnosis or report having an upcoming diagnostic assessment. To probe the use of strategies to compensate for executive functioning, or EF challenges, we developed a new measure. This measure was co-produced with autistic researchers and is therefore informed by autistic people's lived experiences. The measure is made up of 17 items that capture two components of EF: flexibility and emotion regulation. Flexibility includes how readily a person can switch between different cognitive processes or different tasks. Emotion regulation refers to a person's ability to effectively direct and modulate their emotional responses. Example items from this new measure include the following. For flexibility, we ask participants to rate how often they avoid new situations or environments. For emotion regulation, we ask participants how often they use a fidget or some object in order to calm or soothe themselves in new situations. Turning to results, here we see the overall profile of compensation for executive functioning challenges. Just to orient you, the horizontal or x-axis shows each of the two EF domains. The vertical or y-axis displays the mean compensation score. Higher scores reflect more compensation. These profiles are plotted separately for autistic adults assigned female sex at birth, seen in the upper greenish line, and those assigned male sex at birth, seen in the lower purple line. We find that overall, autistic adults assigned female sex at birth compensate more for EF challenges relative to autistic adults assigned male at birth. We also see a difference in the profiles by assigned sex at birth. Autistic adults assigned female sex at birth compensate more for flexibility challenges relative to emotion regulation challenges, whereas those assigned male sex at birth show the opposite profile. Now we move on to a second questionnaire we created, the Sensory Compensation Questionnaire. This measure was also co-produced with autistic researchers and informed by autistic narratives of the lived experiences of a wide range of sensory differences. Sensory processing differences include things like being hyper or hyposensitive to sensory stimuli, like sounds or lights. The Sensory Compensation Questionnaire is comprised of 16 questions organized into the 8 sensory domains shown here. We ask the people who participate in our study to rate how often they use certain approaches. To provide context, the following are example items from each of the first 4 sensory domains. Starting with the auditory domain, I ask people to speak more softly because sometimes their voice seems too loud to me. For the gustatory domain, I avoid certain foods because the flavor is too strong, for example, too salty or sweet. For the tactile domain, I cut the labels out of my clothes because I do not like how they feel against my skin or body. For the visual domain, I use softer lighting, like natural or incandescent lights, because certain artificial lighting, like fluorescent light, bothers me. The following are example items from the remaining 4 sensory domains. Starting with the oral texture domain, I avoid certain foods because of their consistency or the way they feel in my mouth. For the olfactory domain, I carry something with a smell I like in case I am bothered by someone's perfume or another smell. For the proprioception domain, when walking down a hallway, I run a hand along the wall to quote-unquote guide me so that I avoid bumping into the wall or other people. And finally, for the vestibular domain, when I ride an escalator, I take my time getting on and off so as not to feel off balance. Turning to the results, as shown in the figure here, we found a variable pattern of compensation for the 8 sensory domains. Just to orient you, the horizontal axis shows each of the sensory domains. The vertical axis displays the mean compensation score. Higher scores reflect more compensation in the relevant domain. As before, these profiles are plotted separately for autistic adults assigned female sex at birth, seen in the upper greenish line, and those assigned male sex at birth, seen in the lower purple line. We find that autistic adults assigned female sex at birth report greater compensation for sensory processing differences across all 8 sensory domains relative to autistic adults assigned male sex at birth.
Unlike for sensory processing differences and executive function challenges, we did not need to create a new compensation measure for potential daily living skills challenges. Rather, we elected to utilize an existing measure developed for use with older adults by Farias and colleagues, termed the Everyday Compensation Questionnaire, or ECOMP. Daily living skills include tasks like shopping for groceries or preparing meals. The 4 domains we assessed were made up of 27 total questions, with 7 questions each for appointments, cooking, and finances, and 6 questions for shopping. For this measure, the following are example items from selected daily living skills domains. For example, starting with the appointments domain, we asked people to rate how often they prepare ahead by gathering items that need to be brought to appointment. For cooking, how often they make only simple, familiar meals. For finances, how often they pay bills immediately when they arrive, so bills are not forgotten. And lastly, for shopping, how often they check off items on a shopping list as they are found in the store. Turning to the results, here we see the overall profile of compensation for daily living skills challenges. Just to orient you, the horizontal axis shows the 4 daily living skills domains. The vertical axis displays the mean compensation score. Higher scores again reflect more compensation. As before, these profiles are plotted separately for autistic adults assigned female sex at birth, seen on the left side, and those assigned male sex at birth, seen on the right side. We find that overall, autistic adults assigned female sex at birth compensate more for daily living skills challenges relative to autistic adults assigned male sex at birth. To summarize our quantitative findings, we find that autistic adults endorse both a wide variety and considerable usage of compensatory strategies and techniques to address their differences in executive functioning, sensory processing, and daily living skills. This is an important first step in documenting how autistic people compensate for everyday challenges beyond those centered on social differences. We also find that autistic people assigned female sex at birth consistently report greater use of compensatory strategies and techniques for executive functioning, sensory processing, and daily living skills differences compared to those assigned male sex at birth.
Now we are going to move on to the second part of our study, which focuses on qualitative data. In addition to the questionnaires employed in the quantitative study described above, we also ask autistic adults to describe other strategies they use to compensate for or cope with day-to-day challenges. This open-ended question provides rich, complementary, and contextualizing information to the findings we reported above. Of 216 autistic adults who completed the questionnaires described earlier, 126 of them provided responses to our open-ended question about other strategies they use. These responses were organized by us thematically. They represent experiences from both assigned birth sexes and a variety of gender identities, as well as a range of ages from 18 to 80 years. First, autistic adults frequently discuss the use of executive functioning strategies, like careful planning. This planning was used when going into an unfamiliar or new setting, as well as to preserve energy and to facilitate smooth transitions between tasks or events. Autistic adults also discussed the importance of routines and familiarity. This included keeping one's living environment controlled, staying within a familiar setting like one's neighborhood, and maintaining routines and schedules. Autistic adults also indicated the importance of having a friend or other familiar person join them when going to new places. For the executive functioning domain of emotion regulation, autistic adults reported using music or other types of media to regulate emotions. This included repeatedly listening to favorite music or watching favorite programs. Autistic adults also indicated the importance of having breaks and time to themselves to regulate emotions. Stimming was mentioned by many autistic adults as a way to promote positive emotions and dampen negative emotions. Autistic adults reported using different types of stims, including verbal stimming. One participant referred to, quote unquote, allowing themselves to stim. Another mentioned deciding not to live with roommates so that they could freely stim. These examples draw attention not only to the importance of stimming as an emotion regulation activity, but also the impacts of a neurotypical society that can lead autistic people to suppress this helpful activity. Various strategies were reported for sensory processing differences as well. Some of these were reported multiple times. For example, wearing headphones or earplugs in crowded or noisy environments, or wearing sunglasses in brightly lit environments. In addition, autistic adults reported using strategies such as planning and organization to ensure that they were wearing sensory-friendly clothing items each day, while also ensuring that the sensory-friendly items matched. Another emphasized the importance of selectively taking on sensorially overwhelming tasks like grocery shopping on days when they have more resources available. For daily living skills, autistic adults detailed planning and organizing strategies. These included putting things in the same place, planning out one's week, making lists with ordered steps, and scheduling certain activities like grocery shopping. Also reported was taking steps to simplify daily living tasks, like buying only items that are dishwasher safe. Many autistic adults reported using visual prompts, including checklists, Post-it notes, and signs to help ensure that household tasks are completed. Also mentioned was the use of smart devices and apps to help with reminders and with time management. A broader range of strategies were described by autistic adults as well. Many reported using journaling, drawing, exercise, and meditation. Many indicated the helpfulness of regularly engaging in their passions. Autistic adults also reported avoidance of situations that they know would be stressful or overwhelming. This strategy also had downsides like loneliness. One autistic adult described the importance of self-compassion or allowing themselves to accept that sometimes not all daily tasks would get done and that this was okay. Other people described the importance of pets or service animals in their lives. Autistic adults also indicated that they had partners, family, or friends who they talk things over with or who help them with certain tasks like shopping or cooking. Some mentioned having support services or caregivers, and many mentioned therapy as important. Finally, autistic adults also indicated the limitations of compensation and broader difficulties they face on a daily basis. As several people indicated, it's important to keep in mind that compensation strategies, although often helpful, can fall short and exert considerable effort on the part of an autistic person. Broader societal challenges like ableism were also pinpointed as presenting significant barriers to optimal well-being for autistic people. Autistic adults also identified limited access to services or accommodations as another barrier to achieving a high quality of life. Based on these qualitative data, we find that autistic adults provided a wealth of additional information on strategies they use in compensating for challenges they experience on a daily basis. Many of the reported strategies involved activities of enjoyment, repetition, or engagement that self-soothe and calm. Many others involved adaptation of one's environment or the autistic person's fit within that environment.
Taken together, based on our very brief overview of existing published studies and the results we present from our own research, autistic people report using a wide variety and rich array of compensatory strategies and techniques. These approaches, often termed quote-unquote masking or quote-unquote camouflaging in the research literature, are increasingly well characterized for autistic people's social differences. Complementing this existing research, our own study begins to describe approaches utilized by autistic people to compensate for differences in executive functioning, sensory processing, and daily living skills. Autistic people assigned female sex at birth are reporting greater use of compensatory approaches across all domains relative to autistic people assigned male sex at birth. Why autistic people assigned female sex at birth report more compensation is an open question. However, one possible explanation may be found in differences in social norms and expectations based on one's birth sex. Finally, many of these compensatory strategies are bespoke and self-generated. In other words, autistic people are often figuring out how to compensate on their own without the help of others. Furthermore, autistic people often have to adapt not only their own behavior and traits to fit into a predominantly neurotypical world, but must also work against the grain to adapt their environment to optimize their success. We also want to acknowledge caveats and limitations of our own research. For example, our study was limited to autistic adults without co-occurring intellectual disability, which of course only represents the lived experience of some people on the autism spectrum. Therefore, an important future direction for research is to investigate how compensatory strategies and approaches might differ for autistic people with co-occurring intellectual disability. Additionally, the autistic adults in our study identified as predominantly white and non-Hispanic, and many were well educated. This is again a limited perspective and view of the autistic lived experience. Finally, although we describe here frequent use of a variety of compensatory techniques, an important limitation to our study is that we did not assess the effectiveness of these compensatory approaches or their potential trade-offs. We will conclude by providing a couple of very important acknowledgments. First of all, we are incredibly grateful to all of the autistic adults who so generously volunteered their valuable time to help us with our research. Without them, we could not do any of our research. We would also like to thank the students, trainees, and volunteers in our lab who helped to check, score, and code these data so that we could share our findings with you today. And finally, we'd like to provide additional information should it be of interest to you. You can learn more about our lab at the link shown here or by scanning the QR code with your mobile device. Our lab website provides information on resources that might be helpful to some autistic adults. Additionally, more details on the compensation skills in autism study can be found here as we continue to recruit participants. If you would like to contact either of us directly, we've also included our email addresses on this slide.